Welcome to CANUSA Street, a podcast at the intersection of the issues and policies between Canada and the United States. Here are your hosts, Beth Burke and Chris Sands.
Hello, and welcome back to CANUSA Street. I'm Beth Burke with the Canadian American Business Council, and I'm joined by the one and only Christopher Sands of the Woodrow Wilson Center. Hey, Chris.
It's great to see you. It feels like it's been a while, but it's so nice to hear your voice and be back on CANUSA Street.
I know, it's wonderful. After a bit of a break, here we are. And as we step into 2025, I thought it would be great for us to get back into the conversations that bring U.S. and Canada relationship to life. Here we are.
Yes.
I think today we're going to take some time to reflect on the life and legacy of a remarkable U.S. lawmaker, President Jimmy Carter.
I know this is a really a momentous day as we record this. Former President James Earl Carter, the oldest president ever, in the sense that he lived to be 100, which is impressive, was laid to rest, and it was very much a Washington day, wasn't it? I mean, you could see, in fact, all week, presidents of the past, dignitaries of the past, coming out and trying to pay their respects. And even in this very partisan city, which it can be sometimes, there was a sense that people were coming together and remembering a different time in politics.
Absolutely. And I actually just got back to Wisconsin from Washington, D.C., where I had the opportunity to pay my respects to the former president. And, to your point, there were quite a lot of features on TV and articles talking about the dignitaries, politicians, et cetera. But what I got the privilege of seeing was the lines of everyday Americans from all different walks of life, political stripes, coming to pay their respects and, give their moment to the former president as he lie in state in the U.S. Capitol.
It is really powerful because, so many people, their formative years of politics were when he was president. He was president right between the turmoil of Watergate and the end of the Vietnam War. And then we would have sort of later come Ronald Reagan and then sort of the 80s. He's that pivot president, comes in right after the bicentennial, 1776 to 1976. And the country needed a boost, and he brought a very different style to politics. And many people remember that. I want to reconnect with that now.
Absolutely. And since you brought up his, start into the presidency, I feel like it would be unlike me to not find the Wisconsin hook. But
okay.
as many of you may know, President Biden was he was the first sitting U.S. senator to endorse President Carter when he ran. But he came to Wisconsin and stood on stage with candidate President Carter at the time in Madison on March 25th of 1976 to give his endorsement.
That would have been interesting because you will, of course, remember that it was Minnesotan Walter Mondale who became his vice president. So a lot of times we think of Carter as being, from Georgia, he's from the South. But this was one of those classic pairings where he reached out to someone who came from the upper Midwest and kind of brought that two regions of the country that are often associated with a kind of good moral center. And I think that was something that people were glad to see just after so much turmoil in the late 60s and early 70s.
Absolutely. And to that point, that is what President Biden hit on so much in his eulogy was just character. I think he said character. That's what, President Carter instilled in him. And I think it really was so moving to hear so many people in both their eulogies, remarks, but even other podcasts that I've listened to, people really focusing on what a great person President Carter was, not just, a leader of nations, but a good Georgian who went back to his hometown and had good roots and was a man who gave so much to not just the United States, but also maybe move it on to CANUSA Street here a bit, but his real dedication to the international community and building blocks of the relationship with the U.S. and Canada.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. And I feel like in the interest of being on all sides of the street, I was really struck by the way in which even President-elect Donald Trump coming back in, and he's known for his zingers and his put downs, but his comments early on the news that President Carter had died were very respectful. they were very statesmanlike, and it's something that it's a side of him that we haven't seen as much of. And so I thought that was encouraging too. And there is something about somebody who has had that historic impact and the way that it kind of cuts across party lines.
Yeah, absolutely. And, speaking of Canada-US work that the president did, the Canadian American Business Council actually honored President Carter at our annual State of the Relationship back in 2023. And Jason Carter was set to attend and receive the award on his behalf, the president's grandson. And Unfortunately, Rosalind actually passed the same time our event, just a few days before.
Rosalind Carter, the First Lady, is longtime wife.
Yeah. Yes. And so unfortunately, he wasn't able to attend. But if you will allow me, I would love to read a few of the excerpts from the letter that he submitted, because I think it really touches nicely on a few things that, Jason thought and wanted to share. So
Absolutely.
He wrote, my grandfather made his first major contribution to the relationship, meaning Canada-US, as a naval officer when, after a December 1952 nuclear accident, he assisted with the cleanup and disassembly of the power plant at Chalk River. Later, as governor of Georgia, he established the first Georgia trade office in Canada. As president, he invited the heads of state of Mexico and Canada as his first guests. When he welcomed Prime Minister Trudeau, he noted that Canada was our most important trade partner, but he did not limit the discussion to bilateral issues. He discussed global issues with him, as he later did when he met with Prime Minister Joe Clark. He always saw Canada as a major partner in the U.S. world affairs. After leaving the presidency, my grandfather worked closely with Canada through the Carter Center. Over the years, the center has received generous support from Canada and has become a full partner in our work. So it's just so touching to hear his thoughts and remarks on the integral relationship that U.S. and Canada have and what it meant to the former president.
It's very moving, and it strikes on two things that we talk about a lot with President Carter. There was his presidency and how that went, but I think you heard from so many leaders just how remarkable he was as, after his presidential years, he really engaged with the Carter Center, focusing on democracy around the world, doing election monitoring, encouraging leaders to think about how to strengthen the popular support for their governments through democratic means. And later, the Reagan administration would create the National Endowment for Democracy. There are other tools, but we didn't have any of those then. And he was a pioneer in thinking about those kinds of issues. And so really is very touching. But I also thought it was interesting, too. I mean, Carter was an interesting figure because one thing we know about Pierre Trudeau is that he was a very cerebral, very intellectual guy. But Jimmy Carter was a nuclear engineer. Now, philosophers and engineers are not always the best company, but they are super smart. And I think there was a respect between Pierre Elliott Trudeau, Canada's prime minister, and Jimmy Carter that really helped boost the relationship. And there's an episode that people talk about. It's a little bit obscure, but I can't resist sharing. And that was Jimmy Carter's role during the Chalk River almost nuclear disaster. That was pretty amazing, but people have forgotten about that. But it was way before his presidential period, when he was a nuclear engineer and called in to help with a nuclear reactor accident. Of course, this was very early days of nuclear technology, and we all know people who are involved in nuclear energy now, and it was a different kind of technology. So I don't want to sound like I'm anti-nuclear, but it was a scary time, and he was a young man and sent up to try to figure out how he could help.
Yeah, it's quite amazing. He really dedicated himself by mind, body, and soul to everything he did. And I think, to that point, not only was he a naval officer, but he also spent a lot of his time with Habitat for Humanity. And he was volunteering and building homes well into his 90s, which is just amazing. I don't think I could build a home today. I sure could try, but doing it into his 90s is just so amazing.
Well, I had a sort of a connection. It was a funny one, but one of the people who was known in that era was originally a Polish scholar, Zbigniew Brzezinski. And Zbigniew Brzezinski was the national security advisor. And it was funny. I think we just had Henry Kissinger, who had worked for Nixon and then also for the Ford administration. So here you had someone with another European accent coming in, very, very smart man. And his story had crossed Canada as well, because his father was consul general in Montreal for Poland when the family defected. And that was the beginning of their coming to North America, something that they never forgot. And Brzezinski, in his day, talking about Quebec nationalism, which he was opposed to, and the country where he grew up to some extent, was always very close to Canada, another connection. And I had the chance here in Washington to work with a guy named Robert Pastor. And Robert Pastor, who came to Washington after having spent a long time at the Carter Center, he had a connection all the way back to Brzezinski, because he was the Latin America guy on the National Security Council who helped arrange the negotiation to give the Panama Canal to the Panamanians, and was very involved in Latin American affairs. But when he came back to Washington, taught at American University, he wanted to revive North America. And he knew Mexico better than Canada. And I have had many great conversations with him where I always knew when he was in a mood, because he would say, "You're Canadians." Sort of like parents who say, "Well, what your son just did." It always means that it's like your fault. He found Canada frustrating, but there was this sense that was a group of people who really saw Canada as a part of the mix. Sometimes frustrating, but always quite essential and interesting, and they engaged on it. It wasn't an afterthought. So Pastor, Brzezinski, Carter, it was a really remarkable time for America, and I think a time when Canadians felt noticed, listened to, engaged with, important, which is, I think, the way it should be.
Absolutely. Well, I think the last thing we can't omit from our episode here is that he did win the Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, quite an astronomical feat. And I just think we have to mention it because he really did spend a lot of his life working and focusing on advancing peace and alleviating global suffering. So,
yes, and I think sometimes we grade on pretty harshly our world leaders, and time kind of makes you get a bit more mellow about it. At the time, he took on big problems, but he did so, even if he didn't solve them all, he really worked to try to come up with good solutions. And the Nobel Peace Prize was quite deserved, but at the same time, I think most of our Canadian listeners will remember that there was a big role for Canada after the Iranian Revolution brought some Americans in as hostages for 444
Absolutely.
days. You remember that? And they did come home, but after the end of the Carter presidency, right at the beginning of the Reagan one. But this was something that Carter worked on very, very hard, and the Canadians were right there with him, offering their embassy because ours had been taken, trying to keep the diplomacy going and trying to bring the hostages home. And we're still in a world where people take hostages, and so I think for a lot of our listeners, that's a real presence now, whether it's Gaza or wherever, or the two Michaels. But we can't forget that when Jimmy Carter was looking for international support, someone to be a go-between, somebody to help bring Americans home, Canada was first on his list.
They answered that call, right? Yeah, I think that's a great place to leave it for today. Thank you, President Carter, for everything you did for the U.S.-Canada relationship. This relationship is so important and, will stand the test of time and continue to thrive.
And like every other street in America or Canada, we sometimes have to have a little memorial to remember the people who made it what it is. And so we've put a little star on the Walk of Fame of CANUSA Street for President Carter today.
Thank you so much, Chris. Great to see you.
See you again soon, I hope.
This podcast is brought to you by the Canadian American Business Council and the Wilson Center. If you like this episode, help others find our show and give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.